The request was 7 sentences long and did not use her name. Eng's son Farrell read it at the small desk in the corner of the relay room, a second cup of tea cooling beside his right hand. The Thorin Compact's official seal was pressed in the upper left corner, the same seal that had headed every formal communication from the governing body for 310 years, 7 sentences. The word clarification appeared 4 times. Ren Solis's name did not appear once. 6 days had passed since the session, since 33 species had voted, since 4 had not. Since humanity had been permanently excluded from the Thorin Compact, stripped of transit access and shared infrastructure rights, and given 30 seconds to respond before the record was sealed. The response, when it finally came, would be 9 words. Farrell set the document face down on the desk. He did not do this dramatically. He just turned it over the way you'd set aside something you'd finished reading, then he picked up his stylus. No announcement, no ceremony, no reply that used the Compact's language to answer the Compact's question. He wrote 9 words, passed the paper to Ren Solis without comment. She read them, she did not change a single one. The corridor is closed, you voted for that, we concur. The reply went out that evening, standard diplomatic relay, the same channel the Compact had used for 3 centuries. It arrived at the Arbiter's office at 3:40 station time. Nobody was there to receive it. The automated system logged it, timestamped it, routed it to the Grand Arbiter's morning queue. Stay close, the part that matters happened 29 years before that reply was written, and most of it was never announced. 29 years, 8 months, and 4 days before Eng's son Farrell turned that document face down, a woman named Dr. Sen Caldrath walked out of a committee review room in a building in Kampala and did not cry. She had been told politely that her projections were too pessimistic to be actionable. She had been told this by 3 senior officials who used the word unfortunately several times and meant none of it. The 310-page assessment she had written, the one that began with the line "The Compact is not a partner, it is a ceiling," had been read by 2 of them and skimmed by the 3rd. They thanked her for her work. They suggested she consider revising the framing. They did not say what would happen if she did not. Sen Caldrath went home. She made a pot of rice and ate it at the kitchen table without turning on any lights. Then she got out a new notebook and began modeling the alternative. The first entry in that notebook was dated November 14th. At the top of the page, before the first line of text, she wrote 1 word. Ready. Analyst Preva Ossendal had never met Dr. Caldrath in person. She had read the 310-page assessment twice. Once when she joined the continuance program, and once 3 years later when she understood enough to see what the first read had missed. She kept a photocopy in the bottom drawer of her desk in the continuance room. The continuance room was in the 3rd basement of a building in Kampala that had no signage on the exterior and did not appear in the directory of the floor above it. It had 11 desks, 1 long wall of archive drawers, and 1 small window near the ceiling that looked out at a concrete wall. The air smelled faintly of recycled ventilation and old paper that had never been opened for inspection. Ossendal was at her desk the morning of the session on Nuvathul Station, squaring the corners of a stack of loose papers she had already squared twice. She was not aware she was doing it. The papers were already straight. She squared them again. The room had been quieter than usual that week. Not empty. Yen Kareth was at the far desk working through a legal syntax table, her pen moving in short strokes. Commander Foss had come in at 600, checked 3 items on his physical grid and left without speaking. Dr. Thull had not come in at all. Nobody remarked on any of this. There was nothing to remark on. Everything was where it was supposed to be. That was the point. Ossendal straightened the papers 1 more time, then stopped. She opened the bottom drawer instead and took out a single sheet, not the assessment, just the cover page. The Compact is not a partner, it is a ceiling. She read the first line, put it back, closed the drawer. Then she opened the second drawer and checked the 9 folios. They were there, slim matte tan covers, hand-numbered in the lower right corner. Each one bearing only a single mark, the receiving species' own legal ratification sigil pressed in that species' traditional color. No institutional seal, no Compact letterhead, no human delegation name on the exterior. Nothing to suggest to anyone who opened that drawer without context what they were for. 9 folios in a drawer, no names on the covers. Exactly the way you sign something you intend to keep. Ossendal closed the drawer, the latch clicked softly. She went back to her papers. The vote on Nuvathul Station had taken 11 minutes. The Thorin Compact Grand Assembly was built for weight. The ceilings ran 29 meters from floor to apex, which was high enough that the ambient temperature at the top of the chamber differed measurably from the temperature at delegate level. Every surface was the color of old bone, the walls, the tiered platforms, the long procedural benches where species representatives sat in order of their accession date to the Compact. The delegate wells were sunk 1.4 meters below the Arbiter tier. This was not an accident. You were supposed to feel the height before you felt anything else. Grand Arbiter Thavrin Kalesa of the Nuvari Directorate stood 2.3 meters tall in formal vestments, governance gray layered over a rank-piped undergarment in 3 colors. His bilateral throat sacs had flushed amber when he began reading Resolution 12 Delta 4 into the record, the way they always did when he was in full formal register. 7 segmented fingers on each hand, folded together at the podium's edge. He read the resolution title first, then the full formal preamble, then the operative clause. Permanent withdrawal of compact membership, transit access, and shared infrastructure rights from the Human Continuance Delegation, effective upon completion of the recorded session. He used the word permanent 3 times in the reading. He did not use lead liaison Ren Salas's name once. The vote was 33-4. The 4 dissenting delegations, small, quiet, seated in the upper left corner of the chamber, were not asked to explain their reasoning. They were not typically asked. They were the kind of delegations that the compact majority had learned over decades not to ask. Thavrin Kalesa gestured toward the human delegate well. Standard procedure, a 30-second courtesy, available to any affected party before the record was sealed. He had extended this courtesy 41 times in his career. No one had ever used it to say anything that altered the outcome. Ren Salas was already seated when the gesture came. She was 44 years old. She had spent 14 of those years in compact chamber sessions, attending more procedural hearings than she could accurately count, sitting in this specific delegate well more times than she had sat in any room in any building on Earth. She wore the same gray that she always wore to sessions, not a statement, just the color she reached for in the dark before a chamber day. Her hair was pinned back in the way that took her exactly 4 minutes to arrange. When the Grand Arbiter's gesture came, she closed the sealed folio on the podium in front of her. Slowly, with both hands, the way you close something you have finished with and intend to keep. While she stood, she looked once at the 4 delegations in the upper left corner. Not a nod, something less than a nod, the suggestion of one. Then she walked to the chamber door, pressed the latch, stepped through. The door closed behind her. In a chamber with 29-meter ceilings and a session still formally in progress, the sound of that latch carried. The continuance program had been 29 years old on the day of the session. It had 6 operational divisions. It had a staff of 41. Its founding document was a 310-page internal assessment written by a junior policy analyst who had been told politely that her projections were too pessimistic to be actionable. Nobody in the compact knew it existed. That was not an oversight, it was the design. The program had been built inside the ordinary activity of 8 different human institutional bodies, spread thin, documented under routine budget headings, staffed by people whose official titles described functions that were real and did their actual jobs while also doing this. From outside, it looked like normal interagency overlap, the kind of administrative redundancy that large organizations produce and then lose track of, the kind of thing nobody reads the registry to find. Asundal had joined in the program's 9th year. She had been 26. Her official title was Senior Policy Analyst, Interagency Liaison. She had the desk closest to the wall of archive drawers. For the first 3 years, her only job was to count. She counted votes, she counted procedural precedents. She counted which species voted with the Nuvari Directorate on trade motions, on infrastructure access clauses, on membership review decisions. She counted the gap between what species said in open session and what they voted in closed procedural review. She built a model of the compact's decision-making that accounted for 17 independent variables and had a predictive accuracy within a 15-day window of 91%. She had predicted the session date within 11 days. She had been 3 days early. She noted this in the margin of her model as a calibration point. Not a victory, a calibration point. Commander Adren Foss ran logistics. He was a compact man who preferred physical tracking systems over digital ones, not for any philosophical reason, just because he had grown up working with grids and found them easier to read at 300 when he was not fully awake. His grid was the size of a dining table and covered one wall of his office. It had been marked by hand in pencil, then remarked in pen when the pencil started to blur. Each mark represented a human transit vessel moved off a compact monitored lane. He had been moving them for 16 months, never more than 14 vessels per standard cycle. Below the threshold, the compact's trade observation algorithms were calibrated to flag as a pattern, always through routes that individually looked like standard efficiency adjustments, never coordinated in any way that required a simultaneous communication between vessels. 612 vessels, moved one quiet group at a time over 16 months off every lane that ran through a compact-controlled waypoint. The grid had 612 marks on it. Some of the pencil ones were still faintly visible under the pen. Foss did not look at the grid on the morning of the session. He had already checked everything 3 days prior. There was nothing left to check. He came in at 600, confirmed that the 3 outstanding route transitions from the previous cycle had completed without a flag, and left. He was home by 700, he made breakfast, he did not turn on any news feeds. Yen Kareth was the xenolinguist. She was fluent in 11 galactic legal syntaxes, not conversationally fluent, which was a different and less useful thing, but fluent in the specific way that meant she could read a treaty clause in Draenville legal register and know what it was actually saying under the formal language, which was sometimes the opposite of what it appeared to say on first reading. She had spent 3 years drafting 9 bilateral agreements, each one written entirely in the receiving species' own legal syntax, using their own clause structures, their own precedent forms, their own ratification conventions. No human legal language anywhere in the body of any document. The agreements were not translations. They were originals, written in the way that species would have written them for each other. The Draenville agreement had been the hardest. The Draenville legal tradition used a specific clause structure that implied reciprocal obligation without stating it directly, a form that in their tradition carried more binding weight than an explicit commitment, because an explicit commitment could be challenged on technical grounds whereas an implied one could not. You either recognized the form or you did not. If you recognized it, you understood what you were signing. If you did not, you had no idea. Yen had used the form. The Draenville representative had read the draft for 4 hours before responding. Their response had been, "We will need 3 years to complete the internal ratification process." They signed 3 years later. Their folio had been in the archive drawer for 7 months by the time of the session. Yen was at her desk that morning working through a syntax table for a 9th species legal register she had started studying the month before. Not because it was needed now, because it might be needed later. She worked in short pen strokes, the kind that meant she was thinking while she wrote, and did not look up when Asundal opened the archive drawer to check the folios. Dr. Varen Thul had built the parallel corridor from scratch, on the assumption that it would never be announced. This was the only way to build something like this. If you designed it to be revealed, you designed it to be explained, and if you designed it to be explained, you introduced choices that made it easier to explain and harder to use. Thul had made no such choices. The corridor served the function it needed to serve, and it looked, from every external observation point, like routine infrastructure maintenance conducted simultaneously across 9 different species jurisdictions. 17 systems, no compact-controlled waypoints, no relay nodes that reported to any compact monitoring body. The infrastructure had been built into existing maintenance cycles, using contracted labor from the species whose space it ran through, documented under capital maintenance headings that no one outside those species' own administrative bodies would have reason to examine. It had taken 11 years to design and 7 years to build. Thul had a particular way of describing it that Asundal had heard once, in the 3rd year of construction, when she had asked him how he thought about the scale of it. He had said, "I think about it the way you think about a foundation. You don't see a foundation. That's what makes it a foundation." Then he had gone back to his drawings. Aang de Sun Farrell was 71 years old and had been mapping transit geometry since he was 33. He kept a small pressed bark cutting from his home region's flood forest taped to every terminal he worked at, not the same cutting. He had a supply of them, but always one. The bark had a particular grain that he found easier to focus on than a blank wall when he was working through a problem. He had never explained this to anyone. Nobody had asked. He had mapped 17 routes for the parallel corridor, each one using no compact-controlled waypoint. Each route had 3 alternatives, in case primary access to any system was interrupted. Each alternative had been modeled for transit time, risk of observation, and resilience to single-point failure. Farrell had run the routes on a modeling system he built himself, because the commercial systems available through compact license channels recorded query history. His system did not record anything. It ran the models and returned the results and kept no log of either. He was the only person on the team who had physically traveled 7 of the 17 route segments under cover of routine freight contracts. The routes were cleaner in person than in the models he found. He noted this each time but did not file a formal report on it because the information was not actionable. It just meant the models were conservative, which was the right kind of wrong to be. 2 years before the session, a message had arrived in the human diplomatic relay under an address that routed to Ren Salas. The sender was listed as Yeln Voss, Elder Representative, Farath Observation Delegation. The Farath were small, gray-feathered, still-eyed, moving in groups of odd numbers by a cultural convention so old that none of them could explain its origin. They operated deep-range relay infrastructure across several systems that the Compact used but had never bothered to formally incorporate into its technical review processes. They had a small delegation at Nuvathul Station. The Compact majority had never once asked them to vote on anything that mattered. The Farath read extensively, not for pleasure or not only for pleasure. They read the way certain animals track scent to understand what was moving through their space and where it was going. Yeln Voss had read a translated collection of human institutional history, not the victories, the failures and recoveries. The programs that had been shut down and rebuilt. The agreements that had collapsed and been renegotiated. The administrative bodies that had been dismantled and reorganized into something that worked better. Then she had sent the message. Your people have built this before. I would like to understand what you are building now. She was not asking for a treaty. She was not asking for an alliance. She was asking to understand what humanity was doing with the ceiling it had been given. Ren Salas had read the message in the continuance room at a few minutes past 200. She had read it again. Then she had set it down on her desk and sat very still for about 3 minutes. Asundal had been at her own desk when this happened. She had watched Ren read the message and sit still, and she had not asked. Some calibration points did not need to be named to be recorded. Ren had explained it to Yelnvos over 3 separate conversations, spread across 6 weeks. Not the strategy, not the corridor or the folios or Foss's grid on the wall. She had explained what it felt like to build something that might never be needed. What you did with the years when you were not sure the work would matter. How you kept 41 people focused on a preparation that had no visible end date and no guarantee of a trigger. Yelnvos had listened to all of it without interrupting. The Farath Elder was small even by her own species measure, gray-feathered in the way that suggested age without making it explicit. Her eyes did not move when she listened. She went very still. At the end of the 3rd conversation, she had asked one question. How many people worked on this who did not live to see it finished? Ren had been quiet for a moment, 214. Yelnvos had not responded right away. The silence between them stretched out in the way that, in Farath communication, carried weight rather than awkwardness. When she finally spoke, she did not ask anything else. She said, I will make sure the right people understand what they are agreeing to. That was all, that was enough. 3 months later, Yelnvos had sent a second message to the human relay. It was longer than the first. It contained a list of 7 names, representatives from 7 species with whom she had existing diplomatic contact. Beside each name, she had written a single sentence describing what that species valued most in a written agreement. Yen Kareth had read the list and spent 4 days working on syntax structures she had not touched before. The 7 species became 9 over the following year. The 9th was the Drainvel, which Asundal had not predicted. She updated her model. The predictive adjustment took most of a weekend. She noted the revision in the margin. Calibration, not a surprise, not a victory. The morning after the session on Nuvathul Station, Yen Kareth arrived at the continuance room at 5:30. She did not turn on the main lights. She went straight to the archive drawer, the second one from the left, and opened it. The 9 folios were there, exactly as they had been the last 17 times she had checked them. She took them out and set them in a row on the long table. She activated each one in sequence. Not simultaneously. In order. Beginning with the Farath folio, which had been signed 3 years before the session and had been waiting in that drawer for 3 years. Then the Alhari, then the Senevar. Each activation was a single authenticated relay signal, a timestamp confirmation sent to the receiving species' designated legal archive. No announcement. No attached message, just the signal that said, this is now active. She moved through all 9s. She closed the drawer. She closed each folio after it was activated and stacked them back in order. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the syntax table she had been working on the day before. Asundal watched her do all of this from the far desk without saying anything. There was nothing to say. The folios going active was not an event. It was the completion of a process that had been running for years. The event had happened 11 minutes into a session on Nuvathul Station when 33 species voted and 4 did not. This was just the machinery responding. Commander Foss came in at 800. He stood in front of his grid for about 2 minutes. Then he picked up his pen, made the final mark, the 612th, and folded the grid in half. Not ceremonially, just folded it the way you'd fold a piece of paper you were done with and set it on the corner of his desk. 612 human transit vessels moved off every compact monitored lane over 16 months. 26 standard cycles, never more than 14 per cycle. The Compact's Trade Observation Division would flag the pattern in 3 days. By then the rerouting had been complete for 11 days. Foss left the folded grid on his desk and went to get tea. He came back, sat down, and started working on the transition documentation for the first corridor cycle. Dr. Thull ran the final infrastructure handshake at 1400. 17 systems. The handshake ran sequentially across each system's relay infrastructure, completing the technical transfer of corridor management to the parallel network. From outside, from any external monitoring point the Compact operated, it looked like a routine relay calibration across 9 separate jurisdictions, conducted in a 6-hour maintenance window. The kind of thing that showed up in automated infrastructure logs and was reviewed on average never. Thull ran it from a terminal in his office. He watched the confirmation signals come back from each system in sequence and made a note beside each one. All 17 confirmed within the window. At the end, he sat for a moment. Then he sent a one-line message to the team relay, "Corridor live, no anomalies." Lang. Farrell, reading it from the Dis-Sun relay platform 3 systems away, noted once to himself that the routing was cleaner than his models had predicted. He did not file a report on this. He drank the rest of his tea, checked the pressed bark cutting that was taped to the upper right corner of the terminal, and started on the first active transit confirmation. He was 3 days from his 72nd birthday. He had been thinking for the last week about whether to go home for it. He had not decided yet. Yelmvoss convened the 8 species not as a meeting and not as a negotiation. She called it a reading. She had translated selected sections from the Continuance Program's founding assessment, not the strategy sections, not the infrastructure plans or the vote count models. Only the framing, the part that explained what the program had been built against, what humanity had decided it did not want to become in response to a ceiling that had been placed above it, what it had chosen to do instead of fighting the ceiling or accepting it. The 8 representatives gathered in a relay conference space that Yelmvoss had booked through standard Farath diplomatic channels. They came because she had asked. They stayed because of what she read to them. The Draenville representative, four-armed, mineral gray with pressure ridge markings along both sets of forearms, listened for 4 hours without moving. At the end, he said, "We thought they were waiting because they had no other option." Yelmvoss said they were waiting because they were counting. The Draenville representative was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said he would like to read the founding assessment himself, the full document, not the excerpts. Yelmvoss told him she would arrange it. They were not allies by convenience. They were not allies by threat. They were allies by recognition. That was the difference. That was the thing the Compact's institutional framework had no model for, because the Compact had never needed to build alliances through recognition. It had built them through leverage, membership, access. The architecture of a body that controlled enough that belonging to it outweighed the cost of belonging. The 9 species that signed the parallel agreements had not signed because of what they would gain. They had signed because they understood what they were being asked to stand beside. That was a different kind of weight. It did not expire. On day 5 after the session, the Compact's 3 largest member species began requesting clarification from their infrastructure offices. The relay nodes, the ones that handled 41% of the Nuvari Directorate's long-range communications infrastructure, the ones that ran through Farath-managed systems. They had been transferred. 6 days before the session, the Farath Relay Network had completed its technical transition to the Parallel Corridor Agreement. All of it, the entire node cluster, moved under a maintenance and management agreement that had been filed in the Farath Administrative Registry 14 months prior and reviewed by no compact body because no compact body had standing to review Farath internal infrastructure management decisions. The compact had standing to use those nodes. It had never thought to acquire standing to manage them. The Senevar situation was a different order of problem. 38% of the 3 largest compact members' medical compound supply ran through Senevar-processed biochemistry. The Senevar did not manufacture weapons. They did not hold territory. They had no voting bloc in the compact and had never sought one. What they had was a set of biological synthesis capabilities that were, for certain critical compound chains, simply not replicated anywhere else in the compact's supply network. 6 months before the session, the Senevar had signed a preferential supply agreement with the Parallel Network. The agreement gave Parallel Network members first claim on Senevar production capacity in 8 compound categories. The agreement had been filed in the Senevar's own administrative registry, which was public, and in the Parallel Network's legal archive. Nobody had read either registry. Both facts had been visible for months. Neither had been hidden. They were the kind of information that you only find if you know to look. And you only know to look if you have a reason to wonder whether the infrastructure you assume is permanent might not be. The Compact had never had a reason to wonder. The Draenville representative sent a message to the human diplomatic relay on day 4 after the session. Not a question, a request. He wanted to read the founding assessment, the full 310-page document, not the excerpts Yelmvoss had translated. He had heard 4 hours of framing and wanted to understand the reasoning that had produced it. Specifically, he wanted to understand the section that Caldreth had apparently written in a single night, the one that began with the line about the ceiling. Asundal processed the request. She sent the document to the relay address he had provided. Then she sat for a moment, her pen still in her hand, and looked at the archive drawer. The Draenville representative had listened for 4 hours without speaking. He had asked for a 310-page document the day before the Compact's clarification request arrived. She noted both facts, put her pen down, squared the corners of the stack of papers in front of her which were already straight. On day 6, the clarification request arrived. It came through the standard compact diplomatic relay, the same channel the Thorin body had used for 310 years. The filing header identified it as a formal inquiry from the Office of the Grand Arbiter. The seal in the upper left corner was pressed in governance gray. 7 sentences, the word clarification appeared 4 times. Rensalas's name did not appear once. Asundal was at her desk when the message came through. She read it, printed it, walked it to the relay room where Aang Farrell was sitting with his second cup of tea, the pressed bark cutting from his home region propped at the corner of the terminal. He had been working on transit logs from the corridor's first active cycle. She set the printed message beside his tea. He picked it up and read it. He read it all the way through, set it face down on the desk, picked up his stylus. The room was quiet. The ventilation ran its low hum. Somewhere outside the relay room, a door opened and closed. He wrote 9 words, passed the paper back to Asundal without comment. She read them. She did not change a single one. The corridor is closed. You voted for that. We concur. No argument, no counterclaim, no request for further process. 3 sentences, plain words, the meaning exactly what it said. The reply went out through the standard diplomatic relay at 1847 station time. It arrived in the Arbiter's office at 3:40 the following morning. Nobody was there to receive it. The automated filing system logged it, timestamped it, and routed it to the Grand Arbiter's morning queue in the order it was received. Grand Arbiter Thavrin Kalesa of the Nuvari Directorate arrived in his office at 6:06. He reviewed the queue. He read the 9 words at 6:11. He read them again at 6:14. He did not send a follow-up communication that day, or the day after. The 9 words moved through galactic diplomatic channels over the following months. 7 species ran independent translations, checking for a register distinction, a formal-informal split, a conditional tense, a hedging construction that might soften the meaning or open a procedural door. There was no such distinction. The words had been written in standard diplomatic register by a man who was drinking tea and thinking about whether to go home for his birthday. They meant exactly what they said. This was the part that took longest to accept, that there was nothing underneath the words. No subtext, no strategic positioning, no opening position in a negotiation that had not yet begun. The compact had been answered. It had received the answer it had without knowing it voted for. By the end of that month, 6 other species had sent requests to the Human Diplomatic Relay for the Continuance Program's founding document. The Draenville representative's copy had apparently been passed along. Nobody announced this. Nobody filed a formal notice of interest. The requests just came in, one at a time, through standard relay channels. Asundal logged them, sent the document each time, noted the running count in her margin. The Human Diplomatic Annex on Farath Station was a small building. Normal height ceilings, plain walls, 1 entrance. The building had been commissioned before the session, before the vote, before the 9-word reply had been written by a man finishing his second cup of tea. Sen Caldreth had specified several features in the original design brief. The normal height ceilings, the plain walls. And 1 long wall facing the entrance, floor to ceiling, finished smooth. 214 names. Every analyst, economist, navigator, xenolinguist, and logistics officer who had worked within the continuance program across 29 years and had not lived to see the session on Nuvathul Station. Caldreth had specified the order, not alphabetical, not by division, not by rank or seniority. By the date they had joined the program, the order they had arrived, the order they had believed. The first name was a man named Reyes Akafer who had joined in the program's 3rd month and died 11 years later of a circulatory condition that had nothing to do with the work. He had been the program's first logistics analyst. He had kept handwritten notes in a style so compact that Foss, who had inherited his filing system, had needed 3 weeks to learn to read it. Rensala stood in front of the wall on the evening the last folio was countersigned. She had not planned to come. She had been in the relay room reading the Draenville representative's latest message when she had put her jacket on and walked out without saying where she was going. The annex was 15 minutes from the relay building. She walked it without checking the time. The building was empty when she arrived. She turned on the lights near the entrance but not the full overheads. The wall was lit from below, which Caldreth had also specified, because she had said she wanted the names to be readable without glare. Ren stood and read. She did not read all 214. She read 11, the ones she had worked alongside directly, people whose handwriting she recognized, whose specific habits she could still see clearly, the one who had always made tea with the bag left in too long, the one who had kept a photograph of a dog on her desk and never explained whose it was, the one who had predicted in his 3rd week on the job that the Draenville would be the hardest to bring in and had been exactly right. She read the 11 names, not quickly. Caldrath had built the wall in this building and not the continuance room because she had written in the design brief, the continuance room was a working room. You came there to work. You should not have to look at the wall every day while you were working. You should be able to choose when to look. The annex was for choosing. Ren had not chosen the 11 names in advance. She had just started at the top and stopped when she reached the name she had worked beside the longest. Then she had stood for a while without reading anything. Asundal's addendum was written the following morning. She arrived at the continuance room at 7:15. The room was quiet. Yen was not in yet. Foss had left a note on his desk. He had gone home for his birthday. He would be back in 4 days. Dr. Thull's chair was pushed in, which meant he had not been in since the day before. Asundal sat down at her desk. She took out a fresh sheet of paper. She squared the corners of the paper stack in front of her, which had 2 sheets in it. She squared them again. Then she picked up her pen. Caldrath had built the wall. Foss had moved the ships. Kareth had written the treaties, Farrell had mapped the routes, Zull had built the corridor. She wrote none of that in the addendum. The addendum was a record, not a tribute. It covered the sequence of events from the session through the corridor activation, the folio signings, the relay node transitions, and the compact's formal clarification request. It covered the 9-word reply and its reception. It noted, in a footnote, the number of external requests received for the founding document through the end of the month. It did not use the word victory anywhere in the document. At the top of the first page, before the first line of text, in the upper left corner where the date usually went, she wrote one word. She put the pen down, squared the 2 sheet stack one more time. The word sat at the top of the page in her handwriting. The same word Caldrath had written at the top of every completed document for 29 years. The word that was not a celebration and not a declaration and not an end. The room was quiet. The ventilation ran. Outside the small high window, the concrete wall was the same color it always was. Ready,